Allow me to give you a brief introduction, Mr. Novis. You received your Bachelor of Arts degree from Dartmouth College with an English major and a Women and Gender Studies minor. You received 2 master's degrees, one in philosophy and another in theology from the Graduate Theological Union and Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology. Your master's thesis compared the thought of G.W.F. Hegel with St. Maximus the Confessor. As an instructor of Holy Trinity Seminary, you currently teach English composition and literature, history of philosophy, Byzantine philosophy, 2 courses of comparative theology focusing on pagan religions and Christian heretics respectively, and patristics. All right, so Professor Novis, can you share with us how you became an Orthodox Christian after earning a bachelor's degree minoring in women and gender studies?
Well, I was always interested in religions in general. I was an English major, but I took many religion classes, and I was interested in Hinduism, Buddhism. I took a class on ancient shamanism and neo-paganism, all these different religious traditions. And I was trying to discover a path that would be satisfying to me. And eventually, even before I became Orthodox, when I learned about Christ and I read the Bible, I read the Gospels at least, I was impressed by his personality, right? Of all the major religious figures who established religions, the Buddha, Krishna, right? None of them were as pure and as loving as Christ, right? He was the God of love. Krishna was a fornicator, right, of all the goat herdesses. Buddha tended to be very pretentious and didn't lead you to God, right? There was a void in the system, literally. So I was taken to the biblical spirit as soon as I read the Gospels, and it took me a few years to discover Orthodoxy. And it wasn't through academic work, because none of these religious classes actually teach you about Orthodoxy. I learned about Catholicism, Protestantism. I took one class in the Women and Gender Studies program that was called Beyond God the Father. And we did former Catholic nun who became a witch. And that was actually a very good class. But they taught me what not to look for in a Christianity. Right, and that's foreclosed the Western Christian. Eventually, I learned about Orthodoxy, unfortunately, through my ex-girlfriend in Olympia, Washington. She took a class after I graduated from college at Dartmouth in New Hampshire. I worked in AmeriCorps for 2 years, and she was going to college in the Evergreen State College. And there was a class on Russia, and they had a field trip to a convent. And then she came back and introduced me to Orthodoxy and started reading books about it. And this was clearly the true religion, not only because the criticisms of the West lined up both with the critical theory background that I have, the English major and the Women and Gender Studies, were just ways for me to learn critical theory or contemporary philosophy, and also presented a full and satisfying spiritual life in a way that the other churches did not. Before I found Orthodoxy, I was going to a Catholic church and a Protestant church to test out the waters, but then eventually I found the Orthodox Church and I was satisfied. That was it.
You said you became an English major so you can learn critical theory, which is like contemporary philosophy, basically?
Yeah, because the philosophy taught in the philosophy departments is one branch of philosophy known as analytic philosophy, which is a reduction of language and a reduction of true thought to merely what we can see and measure, right? They call it pointer language. So analytic philosophy that dominates the philosophy departments in America, especially the secular philosophy departments, refuses concepts like beauty, goodness, truth, because you can't see them, therefore they're not real and merely an illusion of language. So the philosophy departments never really attracted me. But in the English department and all these other humanities departments, they were engaging with the other branch of philosophy, continental philosophy from Europe, French and German. And those at least attempted to discover some kind of life in the thinking, or thinking was not there to reduce experience to merely material science, but to discover an internal authenticity that gave you a sense of meaning and life. And so that appealed to me. And that eventually was the framework that helped me discover orthodoxy, to discover what is the most authentic and most internally vital philosophical system.
You ended up minoring in women's and gender studies. So how does that play into getting access to critical theory? Is it because it's steeped in critical theory?
Yeah, women and gender studies, you could say, is a subset of critical theory, and using these concepts of authenticity and internal expression to applying it to the women, and recognizing that there were problems with enforced gender expressions in the West, which is true. And I still believe that even as Orthodox, and we have proof of that in the Theotokos and the way the West views her and the way Orthodoxy views her, right? The Immaculate Conception frames the woman and frames the Catholic Mary as an empty vessel receiving a special grace. And once she received that grace, then she is ultimately pure of original sin and is no longer in danger of fall, but simultaneously is no longer has her own free will and agency. She becomes an empty vessel. As opposed to Orthodoxy, the Theotokos is viewed as the most full vessel, the fullness of humanity, where she has actualized herself both in her piety but also her intellectual development, as St. Gregory of Palamas emphasizes in his famous homily, or the entrance of the Theotokos into the Holy of Holies too. And so she becomes not only an image of the fullness of female potential, but the fullness of human potential. So the same kind of reduction of feminine expression in the West never occurred in the East.
So can you give us a summary of your master's thesis?
That was a comparison between Hegel and St. Maximus the Confessor. Hegel, both are attempting to envision a cosmos where the polarities of existence are harmonized as opposed to conflictual or oppositional. So what does that mean, right? The Hegel's famous dichotomies of subject and object, implicit, explicit, form and content, they come from Kant, but Hegel uses them as poles, right? Oppositional poles that don't exist in a contradictory manner, but somehow interrelate and harmonize with each other through complementarity. And St. Maximus has a very similar vision, where the divisions in the world have to be healed by human activity. So for St. Maximus, deification is enacted in the world through what he calls the five mediations. And similarly, Hegel uses the term mediation to understand the relationship between these opposites. So instead of having a dividing wall between the opposites, the dividing wall is lifted and harmony is reestablished. And for St. Maximus, the dividing wall, the conflict, is because of the fall. So in order to overturn the fall, our goal is to mediate and turn the disharmony into harmony. And the five mediations are male and female, and to transcend the gender accident into the universal human nature, which both men and women share, right? There's no men and women in Christ. Again, my women and gender studies feminist background emphasizes that there's no difference between men and women in Christ, because we all share human nature and we're all rational animals. So that's for St. Maximus, the first mediation. And then between the paradisical earth and the fallen world, where we're supposed to turn the fallen world back into an Eden, and that's where in the lives of the saints they enact that mediation, and the demonstration of that, or the proof of that, is that vicious animals become their friends. Right? They become friends with bears and lions. Saint Seraphim with the bear, right? Saint Zosimos with the lion. So there's a re-engagement with paradise in that sense. So you mediate between men and women to elevate to the human nature. Then you, while enacting the perfect human nature, you turn the fallen world beyond yourself into a paradise. And then you mediate between the human and the angelic world. That's the third one. And then between the material world and the general immaterial world, right? The difference between the angelic, that's between persons, and then The fourth is between states of being, right? Living a material state of being versus an immaterial state of being. And then finally, mediate between created and the uncreated. And that's where deification occurs, right? Is when the two worlds unify, not only in Christ in the incarnation, but in yourself as manifesting the image of God in man in the world.
Interesting idea that both paradigms have those similarities, despite coming from completely different backgrounds in both cases.
Unity and difference, right? They all have that in common. Right? How do you unify the difference? And that becomes very important in the modern world because everything's divided, and right, the alienation of individualism is because of modern philosophy. So Hegel's trying to solve that within his kind of esoteric Lutheran perspective. But the problem's already solved in the Church Fathers. And Hegel, right, part of my thesis was criticizing Hegel. He didn't go far enough, or his conclusions were problematic. Yes. And that's why St. Maximus supplements Hegel and corrects him.
It completes the problem.
It completes it, yeah.
So you developed a lecture course called Modern Problems, Orthodox Solutions, which fits very much into your thesis there, that you presented to parishes and youth conferences. Can you tell us about that?
That's to show, first, the implicit assumptions in the modern world based on modern philosophy. Right? People might not think of that intellectual framework. They just go along with the flow, right? And they expect their life on earth to be make as much money as possible, get the best job as possible, and just live this mundane existence. And maybe orthodoxy is on the side, right? It's a cherry on top. But the two worlds don't necessarily merge together or unify because they have different philosophical presuppositions. So the first idea, right, it's not bad to get a job, obviously. It's not bad to make money. It depends on how you make the money. Most of the money-making endeavors in the world today have exploitation involved, right, or some kind of negative consequence to the environment or to communities or to individuals or to yourself. So you want to avoid that. But generally speaking, right, getting a mundane job is not a problem. But it's the philosophical presupposition that, right, that materialism is or some kind of engagement with the material and the practical world is the only legitimate endeavor, right, for a career. What does that mean, right? So pretty much in the world today, you can only be a doctor, lawyer, businessman, or engineer. Right, if you want to be an artist or a theologian, a philosopher, or any kind of more speculative or creative endeavor, generally speaking, because of modern philosophical presuppositions, that's considered a failure, or you're lazy, or you're not being a productive member of society, because one of the main conclusions of materialism is all that matters is manipulating the material world. And if you manipulate, that's the practical reduction of the modern world. So you have to have a practical job that gives you practical rewards, which would be money, right? That's another reduction of the modern world, is everything that is true is quantitative, right? Only mathematics is the key to the underlying reality of the world. And similarly, right, the key to success in society is to make as much money as possible. And both of those are, if taken to the logical extreme, lead to a very empty life, where you become an empty shell. You've put all your effort into your public world, your business or your technology world, but internally, right, there's nothing. Right, all these higher fields like philosophy or even the humanities in general, English, unfortunately taken over by certain agendas, but in general, the humanities were supposed to create a fully flourishing human being. And the sciences are actually an inhuman endeavor, right? They reduce the human person, they reduce life to merely atoms arranged in mechanistic shells, and that are then manipulated by humans using technology in order for them to ultimately satisfy their own passions. And so following that path ultimately leads to internal emptiness. And it's not, again, those paths aren't bad, but if you follow them at the expense of your internal life, at the expense of the humanities, at the expense of deeper theological truths and philosophical realities, then you're missing out on the human experience in general.
What is the orthodox answer to all this, that you have to be doctor, lawyer, businessman, that it's all about the quantity, not the quality, which are actually, when you mention these things out loud, they're very anti-orthodox. So what's the solution? What is the solution that's shared in your talk series?
Well, that's the shift, right? First, the quantitative, right? Money is not the most important thing in life, right? That's huge. And actually, what's unfortunate is that many of these immigrant families, right? Obviously, nothing against immigrants. They generally want to assimilate into the American society that puts pressure on them into, right, assimilating into American values, which are these empty modern values of making a lot of money, having the biggest house, right? All these are quantitative, having the most cars,
Yes.
right? Quantitative versus qualitative. But if you are an ascetic, right? Orthodoxy teaches asceticism, and through asceticism, it's not necessarily just eating nothing. It's a general perspective on the world, right? That is minimizing your desires, and when you realize how little you really need, then you have, right? You realize how much you actually have. So in this ascetic mindset, you don't have to make $1 million a year, or you could make $50,000 a year because you don't need or desire these luxury items that become the center focus of many Americans' lives. Right, you have a deeper focus, you have a more obviously spiritual outlook, right? So you don't need those jobs. So then you're actually freed to find a job that could be more qualitative and help society, help yourself, and help humanity in general. Right? You don't have to become a fancy banker if you don't need that much money. However, right, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be a banker either. You just have to know that to avoid, right, the traps of the banker, and to use your position for the good and to fight against whatever evil is in that in that career. Right? You don't want to become a usurer, right? You don't want to make your money by enslaving the third world or enslaving the Americans, which unfortunately most bankers do, right, through their debt slavery. So, right, that's where the Orthodox philosophy and theology is helpful, because number one, you don't have to become a banker. Right, there's no pressure in that because that's not the value of the human being. And if you are a banker, at least you know better than to engage in these problematic activities, and maybe you can fight back. Maybe you can like use the money that you make in banking to open up some kind of alternative investment scheme that's not usury, that doesn't require compound interest. Right? There's no natural law for stupid compound interest. Right? That's not necessary.
I'm pretty sure in Orthodoxy that usury is a sin anyway.
Exactly. So that's how the Orthodox solution helps you position yourself within this clearly fallen and broken world, so that one, you can avoid it, right? You don't have to get into debt if you have minimum desires, or if you happen to need to be in those positions, then you can fight against it. And that's the important thing. You can't simply just go along with the modern motion of the world. Working in AI is not the evil thing, but using the AI to control the population is evil. Right? So if you work in AI, right, field that's a lucrative field, you have to understand, right, that you're still trying to maintain human values. And if you simplify your life, right, that's the key. Right? Then you don't need all these extra things that become the lure to addict you or to trap you in this fallen society that keeps getting more fallen every day. And then the prayer is the key, right? Well, that's the way of engaging your highest faculties, right? And return yourself to God. But along the way, right, you could pray all you want, but if you are a terrible human being, I mean, that's fine. God can forgive you, but you're still not actualizing your full human nature. But you also have to be aware that you're a terrible human being and confess to it, right? So you still need the self-awareness and self-reflection necessary, right, to understand your position in the world.
All right, Professor. So you're currently working on your doctorate. Can you tell us a little bit about your doctoral thesis?
It is in Byzantine intellectual history, a Neoplatonic philosopher, Christian, and alchemist from the 6th and 7th centuries. And I think that's interesting because it is the intersection of theology, philosophy, but also the magical tradition, which has become an important point in contemporary discourse. Those who are dissatisfied by by Christianity and by atheism and materialism, those who are so-called spiritual but not religious these days are moving towards magic. So to show how orthodoxy didn't just simply dismiss magicians or kill them like they did in the West, right? There was no systematic inquisition to eradicate witchcraft in orthodoxy. It never was until late in Russia, once the westernization of the nation or the empire happened with Peter the Great. But until then, there was no systematic eradication of magic. And also one of the interesting things is that orthodoxy never developed a view of the witch as the most pernicious magical character. So in the West eventually developed the idea of the female witch going to the Sabbath and engaging in illicit activities with the devil to receive magical powers in the most debauched and perverted manner possible. This seems like a projection of Catholic monastic fantasies framed by their problematic scholastic theology. So orthodoxy never developed that. And again, part of my feminism, right? It shows what happened in the West. Not only were the good women reduced to empty vessels, but the so-called unruly women were seen in these extreme evil light of the witch. And again, that never developed in the East because we have a more realistic view of gender that respects women and doesn't just reduce the activity of a woman to merely witchcraft. So the discourse of magic, I think, is very important and very interesting in the modern world, and to show how something like alchemy, which developed out of a magical tradition, was not simply labeled as of the devil by orthodoxy, but was recapitulated into an acceptable almost science at that point, and really became the mediator between ancient alchemy and modern chemistry. Mm-hmm. And it's through the Byzantine repositioning of magic as a science that then bestowed alchemy to the West as a kind of a manipulation of physical materials. And the mutation of matter is the magical aspect, but it doesn't have to be. Don't have to engage with the evil spirits to do that, or any spirits at all. Right? It becomes the magic of nature itself, which is acceptable to orthodoxy.
So it's basically what people would call chemistry today.
Well, yeah, and how people are so enraptured by the so-called magic of modern science. But this is before modern science, so it has different philosophical presuppositions, which also make it interesting. So it's a magic that's no longer magic, reframed as a science, but it doesn't have the same kind of philosophical underpinning as modern science.
What would you consider modern science a paradigm, like a naturalist, materialist type of paradigm?
Yeah, materialist and mechanistic, right? Everything's just atoms arranged into a mechanistic order, where there's nothing in the shell, right? It's an empty shell made of atoms that are lifeless atoms that are arranged in mechanism that can then be rearranged according to human knowledge through technology. Right? That's the modern. You don't have to respect any particular thing as having an essence or life force within it because they're just atoms. So you could take a chicken, you could rip apart its genetic structure, inject new genes into it so it has a giant breast that it can't live with that, it can't move around because its breasts are so big, but it's good for humans to eat because we need more chicken, right? So you violate the internal truth of the animal because you don't think of it as an animal, you don't think of it as a living thing, you think of it as a machine whose parts are interchangeable. But that wasn't the case in the ancient world, right? They respect the living reality in everything, and that's including the Byzantines and the Orthodox.
I see. That's a precursor to what we have today in transhumanism.
Yeah, the mechanistic model is that we have no true human nature, which is atoms, so we might as well rearrange the atoms to do whatever we want.
Can you share with us your teaching philosophy?
I want the students to learn. I think all this material is very important. So I try to be student-centered, even though I give lectures. I think it's important these days in academia. The lecture has fallen out and everything has become the discussion group. But I think the lecture is still important for students to learn. But I'm always open for questions, so they can interrupt me if they want to make a comment or ask a question. I'm always open to students after class, So that's the most important thing, is that they learn. Right? I already know what I need to know, thank God. But they need to learn things. So if I can facilitate that in any way, I'm happy to do so.
Yeah, so one thing that I can bring up, that since I take a number of your classes, that you have a strong emphasis on your students reading primary source material.
That's true. That's all my classes are led by primary sources, so that they can engage in the material honestly without any interpretative bias, right? So they have their engagement with the internal reality of the text, and then we talk about it and interpret it after the fact in class. I become their secondary source ultimately. But before I give you the Orthodox framework, right, I want you to engage with the material as it stands, so you can have honest and immediate engagement with the material itself. And that's why, importantly, for philosophy and comparative theology, my homework assignments emphasize that they should write one paragraph on something good in the reading and one paragraph on something bad. Right, one paragraph on something true and one paragraph on something false. So you give all texts, right, all philosophies, both classical and modern, all religions, both pagan and heretic, the benefit of the doubt, right? At least try to find something good in it, because the fathers emphasize that all human beings desire the truth and the good, right? So even though in our fallen state, in our confused state, we might not achieve that, right? All human beings still desired the good and true. So when they choose something, they think it is good and true, even though it might be wrong, right? But yet, somewhere in their desire is the legitimate reason for their wrong choice. And that's what you have to find is the most important thing, is to give the person the benefit of the doubt, work back their incorrect choices to the correct desire that God implanted in them. Because God created the human constitution, and all our faculties are ultimately good. But we choose the wrong object, and that twists our faculties and destroys our constitution. And that's what sin is destruction of our nature through using it incorrectly.
Finally, Professor, what do you think has been the most rewarding aspect of working at Holy Trinity Orthodox Seminary?
Well, the whole experience is blessed, thank God. Not only being in a monastery, in a spiritual environment, but having students that are engaged in multiple levels of thought, right? Not just the spiritual, but the philosophical, the social aspects. They're generally very curious, and they wouldn't come here if they weren't. Right? It takes a special kind of student to give up everything to learn theology, which, according to modern presuppositions, is ultimately useless. Right? You're not going to find a lucrative career as a theologian, unfortunately. But again, quality and internal actualization, right? There's nothing better. And so they come here, they sacrifice other careers in order to learn this material. That's worth everything. That's the whole point, right? Unfortunately, I think, I don't know this, I don't want to dismiss all secular universities as terrible, but I assume that 90% of students in a secular university are only there to get through, to get a degree, so they can get a job, and even the job doesn't matter, all they want is money. So their internal curiosity, I think very few people have that in the secular world, but almost everybody has that here.
That's great. All right, thank you very much, Professor.
Oh, well, thank you. That was my pleasure.
Great.